Hi, welcome to the March 4th meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. At today's meeting, the last I looked, we had one item on the agenda, and that is that we're having a visit from a couple guest speakers who are authorities on the subject of snapshots, both as reflected in the Kubernetes APIs, the container storage interface plugin system, and ultimately, if the storage plugin is vSphere, the CSI plugin itself for in the form of the particular implementation for vSphere supported storage. I've learned that Gopala had a conflict arise at the last minute, so he will either be late or not here at all, but Jing is here, and she's also joined by another colleague. So I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Xinyang. I'm a tech lead for CNSDP and the vSphere CSI driver projects at VMware. I'm also a co-chair for Kubernetes 6 storage and Kubernetes data protection working group. So yeah, so should we just get started now? Steven, or you want to talk about anything else before we start the first topic?
I guess I'll just give the advisory to users and representatives of users who are here at the meeting that this is not expected to be a full-out presentation. The request here is that we have some people who can influence roadmaps, both on Kubernetes, CSI, the vSphere product, who mainly are looking for your feedback. So you're welcome here to, I think we've got a poll plan, but you're welcome here to just come in with whatever questions you might have, opinions, wish lists, indications of problems or things you've had. Just bring it on, because this is an opportunity to impact the future. So that's it. Back to you.
Okay. Yeah. So we are looking at adding CSI snapshot support in vSphere CSI driver. So we want to gather some requirements from users that will help us make our design decisions. So maybe I should just share this Google Doc. Let me see. Can you see this? So yes, so here are the requirements. It has a set of questions that we come up with. I'd like to go through this list, and then if you know the answer, if you can like add +1 next to each option, that will be helpful. But we can of course discuss about this one as well. And this can be multiple choices, so whatever you feel.
Do you want me to drop a link to this document in the chat
yes.
window so people can open it? Okay.
Yes, please. So the first question is, what are your use cases for CSI snapshots? So what do you use that for? Do you use that as a backup solution? Are you using some backup software that depends on CSI snapshot, or you are just want to you want to take a snapshot and then you want to revert using that, or you want to clone from that, or is this just for testing, development?
So I guess the ask is, if you go in the document, just put a plus sign there. I think it's possible, with the exception of the none item, it could be you want to do all of these. So
yeah, that's fine too. Yeah,
maybe you can put pluses on multiple lines. If there's anybody who's joined Zoom via a cell phone and has trouble opening the document, please just answer. Hopefully you can at least see it. You're welcome to just verbally indicate your preferences, and somebody will type your answer in for you.
And also, if you want to put your company name, and if you feel comfortable, that's up to you, right? That's fine too. Doesn't matter whether you add that or not.
Also, I think, unless you want to counter me on this, if we missed some category or you had some other thought, feel free to add some freeform text at the bottom on the subject of CSI snapshots. Is there anybody, by the way, who doesn't even know what a CSI snapshot is? I mean, I don't want to assume that, but the idea is that for stateful apps running under Kubernetes, they would typically not use storage directly in a Docker container. These would be volume mounts. So the idea of a snapshot is that underneath these volume mounts, there's typically a hardware implementation. And in enterprise IT, these storage hardware implementations usually have acceleration features to create a recoverable point-in-time snapshot of that volume that can be recovered more or less instantaneously, or at least in a matter of seconds. So CSI has an interface that would trigger these snapshots being captured. So just in case somebody didn't know what we're talking about here.
Okay, I see folks has already added their options. Thank you. Yeah, so, and then the second question, if you want to use the CSI one snapshot, do you have plan to move that to a public cloud or an on-prem location, or just want to keep that on your primary storage? Okay, that's that. And then.
And just as background, I hope I'm not talking down to anybody here, but the reason that you might want to move it is certainly if you're doing this for backup, a snapshot by itself is generally held in the same primary storage that you've been using, in production, so that if you had a hardware failure, keeping it there is going to lose both the running copy as well as the snapshot. So it's not a good solution for backup, but it might be an okay solution if you were doing just a test reconfiguration, were worried about whether that was going to have bad side effects and just wanted to recover and weren't so much worried about a hardware failure.
So I have a question about this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because I mean, these are volumes that are being accessed through the CSI. Right?
Yeah,
We're talking about a CSI functionality.
Yeah.
So, okay, so I mean, I'm still, pretty green on Kubernetes, and the customers I'm working with, they're not doing much with Kubernetes yet. So I don't really see many container native use cases yet around these snapshot needs. Right now, a lot of people are just assuming you can't do it, so they don't make that assumption in the applications, at least what I've seen. But if I take this back to my experience from kind of vSphere admin stuff, usually the usual use case I've seen for snapshots around VMs is when people are doing upgrades. It's not even usually the data or the mutability of the data around the application they're worried about. It's the configuration of the application. That's where I've seen snapshots used mostly, when you're doing an upgrade of a version of a software. The software is installed on the VMs. It's very easy to make a snapshot, because if something goes wrong with the upgrade, you simply roll back and you have your old version of the application again. But that entire way of working is already completely different with containers, because the version of the software you're running is controlled by the container image. So that whole problem already went away with containers.
Yeah,
So
it is a little different, and you're right about that being a very common use case for snapshots. In fact, I've seen a lot of the docs, including docs for VMware products, actually advise you to take a snapshot before you do the upgrade, just so that you can recover. And that's the one where it pops to the top. A lot of people are actually using these snapshots, perhaps unknowingly, when they do backups, just because things like the VMware data protection appliance that is bundled into many of the editions of vSphere actually triggers a snapshot when you do a backup, but maybe a user could be unaware that this is going on. And the actual reason for that is that if you were not to trigger a snapshot and do a backup while something like, say, a SQL database server is still running, that act of copying the data off a volume could take an hour. And maybe the beginning of the volume corresponds to a different point in time from the end of the volume by the time you read it. And the net result is that backup would probably be trash, because it's taking parts of that disk image at a different point in time from others. And you could have things as ugly as the index table on a file system doesn't actually match the data. So the way that the backup works under the covers is that it really does literally take a point in time snapshot. In vSphere, it has the effect of actually stalling out the CPU on that virtual machine so that it reaches a point and it kind of browns out performance where IO operations to the disk get queued. Well, some trigger is signaled to the backend storage to say, make a stable image of all of this. And then that backup is taken from the stable image, not directly from the running copy. So essentially every backup product I'm aware of does this under the covers, but you might be oblivious to it just because the abstraction provided by the backup product hid this so well that you weren't even aware that it was going on. Now, other scenarios for doing snapshots that come up all the time are test dev, where you might do something like want a consistent test case for whether something works. And what you want to do is run your test, and the act of the test might scribble on some volume so that the next time you run the test, it's slightly different. People would often do a snapshot, run the test, and then flash this thing back to its original connection state, so that every time you do the test, you're starting from the same exact starting point. And with regard to containerized being different from VMs, it turns out that these CSI snapshots are specifically made for the container world, where these volumes are a little different from VMs. In legacy vSphere VMs, a snapshot was actually a snapshot of a VM. So that VM might have 3 drives, but the snapshot process, it's your option, but it could have even captured the memory inside that VM, as well as all the disks. You didn't have individual atomic access to one drive at a time. You were doing the entire VM, whether you wanted everything or not. Now, that said, there were ways you could opt out certain volumes, but the default in vSphere when you snap a VM is you get everything. With best practices in the container world, some of these volumes might be ephemeral, meaning you don't want them recovered or they're not considered desirable to incorporate. So the CSI process envisions individual control, one volume at a time, and they're disassociated with VMs. And that's an important concept, because the VM, if you're running Kubernetes, is really a Kubernetes cluster node. It could be running a dozen pods at the same time. You would actually never want to back up at a VM level, because you'd be touching storage associated with, I don't know, a dozen random pods, and your phishing net would gather in volumes that you really maybe don't even have permission for. So the way CSI works is a little bit different, but I don't know, long-winded potential answer or attempt at explanation. And maybe if you have a follow-up, go for it. And saying if you're trying to collect an answer here, so maybe you want to embellish for people new to this, you know, how they might choose which of these are important to them, maybe more by the use cases they're using. One other thing let me mention is that I think if you're going to move stateful apps like SQL database servers to Kubernetes, having this facility is essential. I mean, if you don't have it, I don't think you can back them up. But certain other stateful apps that are cluster aware, things like Cassandra, MongoDB, that have their own cross-node replication, it turns out that those often have backup advisories such that it's not actually valid or desirable typically to back up one cluster node at a time in isolation of all the others. Because if you roll back one cluster, let's say I have 7 clusters and then have leader election, I back up just 1 out of the 7, roll it back in time to where a week-old edition suddenly appeared out of nowhere, which is what it would look like if I roll back just that one instance. It's like the immune system of Cassandra or Mongo would spot that this thing is out of time sync and they totally reject it. And that is just never going to work as a backup process. Now, you know, getting into the detail of how you back those up or whether you even do it, that's a whole meeting unto itself, but that's probably not a use case for these kinds of snapshots. Sheng, you or Miles, you look like you waved your hand. Did you have a comment?
I did, but Sheng, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
No, I didn't. I was just think whether I should move down to the questionnaire, or it looks like people have already given their answers. So maybe I don't have to go over this.
I see Bryson's unmuted. So Bryson, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say like the immediate use case I see is like Valero already has snapshots available for other cloud providers. So I'm assuming that's what I'm curious what you mean by backup use case. If you're just saying, exactly what you mean by that. But for what I would see is like using it as a backup. There's a lot of things we keep in a persistent volume that's more of a cache, not like vital to have it, but if I can restore it, that means I don't have to resend all the stuff. So that goes down to like your where did you put it?
Is it kind of like an opportunistic store type thing, Bryson?
That would be more like, hey, so there's kind of 2 use cases for that. Like, hey, if there was an issue and with vSAN and everything was lost, it'd be nice to have it somewhere else on-prem to be able to help restore. But then most of the time we don't have issues like that, but we may have an issue where we lost, it's just easier to rebuild a cluster. So maybe you could still have that like within the same storage, but then rebuild the cluster and then restore from there. So yeah. I think we probably like, maybe both options there. Yeah, and the reason I say on-prem is just because for us, we have a lot of remote locations. And so that's why that backing up that cache matters, because yeah, we can always create that cache again, but that takes time and bandwidth.
Yeah, and often at those remote locations, your bandwidth constrained, particularly the bandwidth may not be uniform with regard to direction, right? Or even with some public clouds, they might charge a lot more for egress than they do ingress.
Yeah, so I think that you can actually if you're familiar with Valora, you can use Valora. We do have a Valora vSphere plugin that work with Valora. So the existing solution does not use CSS snapshot, but it does take a snapshot and then upload that data to an object store. But you are talking about a on-prem solution. So for example, we do have integration with PowerProtect. So that can actually get backed up to PowerProtect's backup device. So that would be an on-prem, one type of backup solution. You could also, so are you using vanilla cluster or are you?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to think about the.
So like here's a use case where we've, let's say we have a lot of clusters. So let's say we got several versions of Kubernetes behind. Sometimes it's easier to just rebuild the cluster with the newest version than to go multiple upgrades. And so what we've used, one thing we've done in the past with that PV, so we don't have to rebuild that cache, is disconnect the PV from the VM. So when we tear it down, the PV stays existing in vSAN. We build the new cluster, and then when we recreate the PV, I specify, right, we don't recreate, I guess we don't recreate the PV, but when, I guess when I create that persistent volume, I'm going to tell it to use that PV that's already in storage.
Okay, so that's like a static provision basically. It's going to provision a new PVC to bind with that existing PV, right?
I mean, it's technically it's a dynamic PV, but I specify which PV to already, like I say it's already exists. Okay. I basically restore that PV and say, hey, if this PV exists, like this is what it is. So that would be something that would, it's kind of a hassle. We have a script to run before we rebuild and then a script to run after. But
it sounds like it might be like a really bad day if it screws up too and you lost one that you had hoped to carry over. But so I mean, that maybe if there was a way to build this in automated,
it's just cache, so it's not as big of a deal. But yeah, if you're rebuilding clusters and you want to get them up fast, you want that cache there as fast as you can. So we do in those scenarios, we also do a Valero backup and a Valero restore. So that's a situation where it'd be like, okay, it'd be nice if when we did the restore, we could actually just have it restored like that.
Yeah, if you, you are saying that can restore actually don't create a new PV. Is that your?
Basically, if I in Valero, I say take a snapshot of it, it should also restore the snapshot, right? When you're doing
that we can do, right? I thought you were talking about something like if you have the PV there, you actually hoping Valero does not go try to create a new.
No, I would just assume it would use the snapshot. I was just telling you what we were doing because we didn't have that functionality.
Okay.
We don't have an object store there local on site that we're sending things to. So we don't use any, like you're talking about of like, are you talking about of like using like Residic or Residic?
I was, when you were talking about on-prem, I was because I was talking about we have the PowerProtect integration, but I was thinking if you don't have that, I was going to say we have the like on Pacific, we have the persistent service, right? We have like a Minio, that type of object store that's kind of on-prem, but that's Pacific, right? If you're using vanilla, then that's not there.
Well, of course, Minio is an open source project, so you could stand up your own Minio as well.
Yeah, that's
and what you're doing there is essentially you're creating your own S3 rather than using Amazon's. That might be a little oversimplistic, but that's the gist of it.
I think it's going to be a little tricky to make that Minion setup really reliable. I mean, yeah, they probably need to follow their instructions if you really want to do that.
What would be nice is to be able to have that snapshot, and in our use case, be able to put just say, hey, use the same storage for the snapshot, or be able to specify some other storage.
Same storage. What do you mean? You mean the like a primary storage? That's what you mean, right? You just want to store it locally? Is that what you mean?
No, well, I mean the vSAN that's at that site.
Yeah, I think that's actually like the definition of snapshot, that once it's it's cloned or moved to secondary storage, it really is no longer a snapshot. So just a little more background for those who, I don't know, I've had a long background in this because I worked on backup appliances at multiple points in my career. But the way this goes on under the covers is that the snapshots are usually what they call copy on write, where when you say, I want a snapshot, the disk is just left intact, but they put another layer saying that any writes that occur after this snapshot has been designated, I'm going to start writing a Delta file. And the Delta file then is viewed as a layer that goes on top of the original untouched data volume in physical storage. And they can build up. So you could have 3 or 4 or 20 plus snapshots, but there really is a limit of how many you want left around, because each time you create one of these Delta layers, when you do reads on that volume in your running copy, it has to go first, look whether any deltas exist, see if there has been a change logged on top of the original base level volume. And the bottom line is it slows down your IO operations. You get lower and lower max IOPS, the more snapshots you have in existence. And that's the reason I think in this poll, there's this question about, do you want a cap on the number of volume snapshots that are allowed to exist? In traditional vSphere back in the VM days, performance got so bad when you hit around 28-ish snapshots that after the first release, when this feature came out, they capped it and just caused the API to fail when you reached a level beyond that, just to give some feedback to a user that, hey, what's going on here is not likely to result in you having a good experience. With this many Delta layers, the performance of what used to look like an enterprise disk has probably degraded to where it's like an old legacy floppy diskette or something. I mean, it could get that bad in terms of latency and disk transfer rate. So, you don't want to keep an infinite number of snapshots, like 1 per day for a year. And luckily, if you're doing these for the purpose of backup, stats show that most of your backups occur from things like human error or a bad update, so that 80% of the recoveries from backups are from the immediately prior backup. You don't go back and pull one out from a year ago. And maybe you might pull one out from a week ago or a month ago if a problem went in there and was subtle and went unnoticed for a long time. But the scenario was generally going to be that you kept the snapshots, say, for the last week or maybe the last month. After that, they get rolled into secondary storage where they're cheaper than using your primary and maybe off premises, so that if you had a horrible disaster like a fire, hurricane, meteor strike, your data has migrated elsewhere. So I think what we're getting at here in this poll with regard to this cap on snapshots is that there is some limit. The questions about whether you want them automatic is they are convenient, because it's way quicker to restore from a snapshot of fast primary storage than it is to record. Even if you operated your own Minio server S3 like, the IO speed going in and out of that thing is much lower than primary storage, which is going to be an SSD these days. So that you maybe want a handful of these snapshots to exist for rapid recoveries of recent images, but maybe for ultimate DR purposes, you also want to supplement it with a little more.
Hey,
Anyway,
I think, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
No, I think that also one of the differences though is that a CSI snapshot is much closer to almost like a NetApp snapshot or a SnapMirror snapshot in the sense that it's a volume-based snapshot rather than a VM snapshot, and they're used for completely different use cases. And I think that CSI snapshots are a huge thing for on vSphere, also not only for tools like Valero, but other backup tools, whether that be Casten or whatever it is that exists out there that currently require full backup every single time, and no such idea as an incremental backup because they can't take snapshots on vSphere today. So I think that definitely having that is a huge benefit, having CSI snapshots for other backup solutions that exist out there, let alone that it would make the vSphere plugin in Valero much easier because it could just use the beta CSI plugin, CSI snapshot, or when that goes GA in Valero.
Yeah, and by the way, this, when you
Right.
said like a NetApp snapshot, if we're talking CSI, they might literally be a NetApp snapshot. This is open.
Exactly.
So you could put a
is.
CSI driver in here
Right.
for NetApp. And
Right. In
it would
Trident,
be-
in the open source one, it is. It's using SnapMirror there. So I'm definitely, and in those cases, like NetApp has a limit of over 1,000 snapshots per copy, because there's differences when you're talking about a volume versus the snapshotting of a VM in the way that it works. And the technologies for snapshots are different, and vSAN has different snapshot technologies than regular VMFS does, and FCDs have a different API for snapshots, and everything is so different in the different versions and what their use cases are. But I definitely see a huge use case for snapshots. A lot of it is also for tools like Valero, Casten, and all of that that's been talked about. But what we see by a lot of our customers is for both cloning and test dev, easily being able to take a snapshot of the production environment and then restore that into another namespace in order to allow you to go and debug an application or to easily copy over the data, basically, so you can then create a new PV from that snapshot and start testing things, is a huge use case that we see, being used in public clouds and on-prem if using CSIs that support it.
Shane, just on the use cases, I know this one isn't listed specifically, and maybe it falls under clone and test dev, but for example, customers that are building ML models, the model itself usually needs revision control, and that is essentially your IP, right? And generally, if you're spinning up something like that for data scientists to work on, you have a model and you want to clone that particular version of the model out for them to test on and that kind of thing. So I think that's probably another use case that's worth calling out. But then it raises another question, which is also related to the number of snapshots per volume, which is this like intended to be a universal point in time type thing, or there's going to be like a finite number and you can only call back those snapshots in that tree, rather than I want this specific version and you get that version back? Is there any limitations as to, say, I want the one from 2 versions ago, but I still want to keep the most recent ones there in case I need them again? Is that like something that's coming into this too?
Well, you should be able to choose which one you want, but there's just right now there's a limit. The current limit is 32 per FCD, but I think we are looking at whether to expand that to increase the limit. Yeah, you should be able to use the ones in the middle. It's not like you can use the last one or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I've also heard people are asking about the machine learning use case, right? Yeah. So
right, yeah. I mean, there's some specific solutions out there that cater exactly for that revision control of the models and stuff like that. On the clone use case, that would be to pick a snapshot and do a full clone from that snapshot into another thing, and that's essentially a fresh slate. Is that the correct understanding?
Yeah, that's a full. Yeah, that's basically it's an independent volume, right? It's just a full volume. That's
okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also one of the key things is, obviously snapshots they're useful, they're not backups. As you know, it is important to note, which is why I think that long lifetimes of snapshots are not necessarily something that is also necessary, possibly. So that's why I do like the idea of delete based on expiration date. I think that, they're useful for the backup process and they're useful for specific use cases. They are not backup. That's what Valero is. And it can utilize CSI snapshots to achieve a full backup.
Yeah, I think often rookies misunderstand them and abuse them, but you're right. I back that in. I see Robert has a question along those lines in the chat, Shing, if you would like to talk to it.
Let me see.
One of the things that happens if snapshots get out of hand too is even suddenly a desire to catalog them, where you discover that, hey, I've got 20 of these snapshots here. I don't even know who created them. And I'm afraid to delete it because if I don't know who did it or why, I get insecure. So I don't know if anything being proposed plans to address a catalog, but the moment you allow more than a handful, that's probably a valid ask that some system be in place to both catalog the purpose and owner, and maybe even impose access control, because I've seen in the backup world, a common scenario people don't worry about initially, but sooner or later is going to bite them, is that backups take place in the old days, VMs, and people unleashed backup systems that assign these backups to individual users. But over a long enough period of time, that user could leave the organization. So a backup got assigned to somebody who left the company. But if the permissions were tied with this now ghost person, you've got a problem. So that ultimately many of these things ended up having to have fairly complex administrative controls and governance over who gets to access these. And I don't know if any kind of governance is architected into CSI snapshots or not, or if it's just presumed that you have to be a Kubernetes admin to get to these, and if you are, you get to all of them.
So should we go over this this question here? Let's see.
Yeah, I
If
just
you don't
typed
mind,
them out. I just typed them out to get them written down because
yeah,
empty my head.
And Shing, if you don't mind, I'd like to reserve some time in the meeting for the users to ask just free form questions.
Yeah, of course.
Outside the scope of the poll. So
let me just let me stop sharing so you can drive this. Yeah.
So, the poll is an attempt to sort of organize a wish list, questions, concerns, but if any of you have things that have just been bugging you lately, or you've thought of ideas for things that would greatly help things out, or just even comments on where you're finding the documentation or your ability to learn how these things work are difficult, we'd like to listen to those kind of comments.
So one of the things that's motivating my first question is there were very good reasons that in the vSphere world you could not rely on snapshots as being a backup mechanism in and of itself. The performance hit, the way they worked presented a risk to the data, especially when you got a lot of deltas. There was a lot of ongoing I/O, and it was that very reason that in my experience, many people stopped trying to make snapshot backups of things like SQL servers and Oracle servers because the continuous I/O was just too much. You'd get into crazy snapshot tree or delta situations they would never resolve. You'd have to turn the whole thing off to actually get it to merge all the snapshots, and that would maybe take a day to do. Now, as time has gone on and storage has gotten faster and vSphere has improved, that problem has gotten less and less, but it still exists today. So my first question, when you make the assumption that you can use the CSI snapshot mechanism as a kind of backup solution in and of itself, all those questions come to mind. Like, how does it deal with deltas? How does it deal with stunning? How does it deal with queuing of I/O? What's the performance hit on the application? And to go even more deeply than that, in order to even be able to do a snapshot of an application, especially applications that had very specific I/O patterns, the VMware tools would provide a hook. And then on top of that, application authors could even write a hook on top of that. Typical example, Microsoft Exchange, for example, Exchange Server or SQL. The VMware would indicate to VM tools, oh, I'm about to make a snapshot. Tell the OS I'm about to make a snapshot. So the OS would start stunning its I/O streams to disk so that you get a clean state that it could make the snapshot in. And then if you were Microsoft and you running Exchange on that server, you'd made a hook into that mechanism. It's called the VSS mechanism. Then you could also give a signal to Exchange. Oh, Exchange, a snapshot's about to be made. Please stop writing I/O in this particular way. Stun your own I/O so we get a clean state. Signal goes back to vSphere. Okay, we're clean. Do it. Snapshot is made. Then I/O can continue, and then I/O, all the extra writes end up in a delta. The reason all these hooks were made, of course, because you want to have a clean state when you do the snapshot. So my question is, in the Kubernetes use case, in the CSI use case, how aware can the application be that a snapshot is being made? Is there something similar to this multi-layered hook system that we're used to in VM snapshotting? How clean can the snapshots be?
So yeah, so the hook is actually, it is not part of the CSS snapshot feature itself, but we're actually working on another proposal. This is in Kubernetes upstream called container notifier, which is to allow you to add some pod definition so that you can actually say, I want to quiesce, I want to run this command before taking a snapshot. So that's still ongoing, still in the design phase. Takes a long time to build things in the community. But that's, yeah, so, but right now, let's say if you're using Valara actually provide a way for you to add those kind of hooks. So to quiesce the application before taking a snapshot. So you can actually achieve that consistency that way. And yeah, so yeah, you're right. So I see your notes, right? Snapshots are not backups, it's correct. I think right now there are some people are getting more confused because our CSS snapshot interface, it's designed to support all type of storage systems. So that include our storage systems, NetApps, Pure, but also includes Google's GCPD and AWS, EBS. Those type of storage, they behave very differently. For like AWS, EBS, actually, when you take a snapshot there, it actually will cut the snapshot first, and then it will actually upload that somewhere to an object store already. It's going to take some time. Of course, it's slow to upload. But so for them, it's like this boundary between snapshot and backup got blurry because their snapshot is actually backup. That's why many people are confused after we introduced the CSS snapshot. They're saying, oh, is that what this means to be? But actually when the CSS spec, when we introduced the CSS snapshot in the CSS snapshot spec, we mean to support all type of storage systems. But that's why, we have that question there. We don't know if some people are confused if they are, if they want to use it just the same way as AWS EBS, then they thought it's the same way, right? So it looks like you already know that the VM, our snapshot, the local snapshot, so it's not really a backup. It's actually, and we know that there are benefits for a local snapshot. It's quick, but if you want to revert, you want to clone from it, it's quick. Because if it's a AWS EBS type of snapshot, it takes a long time because it has to download the data first.
So Robert, I think Sheng, go ahead, Miles.
Have you got any thoughts on distributed snapshotting of an application that requires stuns in multiple locations at the same time?
So I think that's one of the question for like cross multiple vSphere data store, cross zone, right? So that's something that if there are requests, we'll look into how to do that, but it's not there yet. So, but we do have that in our questionnaire.
I interpreted that question differently. I thought that was like the ability to clone across data stores and stuff like that, rather than be able to do a distributed snapshot.
Yeah, the distributed snapshot is tough. And I think, Sheng, you've been going to more of these meetings than I, but even within Kubernetes, in terms of getting hooks in here, it goes beyond storage. So SIG storage in the Kubernetes project talks about CSI, but SIG apps is the one that would be considered probably more relevant with regard to AppKS. And there isn't just AppKS, by the way, because this goes back years too, Robert, but you do have to KS the app like you were talking about. And that's usually that most apps for performance keep a lot of cache in memory, but to get a valid backup, you have to tell the app, hey, flush all this memory down to disk because I'm only making a copy of the disk. And if you had the latest data up in memory only and it hasn't flushed yet, my backup is no good. But there's a corollary to this in that many of these apps, like database servers, keep transaction logs, and those logs, you don't want them growing to infinity. For redundancy, they keep these logs, but the typical backup product has always had a secondary hook that takes place. The KS is the first stage. You create the volume snap, you copy the snapshot to external storage, S3, in the old days, even physical tape, whatever. Then once you know and can verify that this is on tape or this is on secondary storage, so I could tolerate a complete loss of my storage, Meteor comes from space and obliterates it, I can get back. Then you want to signal to the app saying it's safe to truncate your logs now so that your logs don't grow into infinity and fill up all your storage. And so that there's kind of a back-end signal too. Now, I believe if you use Restic, that there's at least the facility that lets somebody build out both of that initial and that kind of finalizer stuff, but it has to be done on an app specific basis. So Kubernetes itself doesn't know about the apps it's running. So it actually doesn't have enough knowledge to know all the internal details of where the log files even live so that it could truncate them. It doesn't know or even have access to the memory to cause it to get flushed down to disk. So you need these kinds of things to be written on an app by app basis, and to have the big picture implemented, it's actually a tricky storage where as a foundation, it has to be enabled in the storage plugin, then in Kubernetes, but then finally, somebody's got to do the actual work that is very much app specific. And that's probably going to be the last thing that ends up being written. But so this is a work in progress, I suspect.
Yeah, but the same was true for VM snapshots, right? Microsoft made that system available in Windows. There's something similar in Red Hat. So you're dependent on the OS vendors. Almost no application vendors ever made use of those hooks, except Microsoft themselves for Windows in certain cases. So it was always an assumption that a snapshot was dirty in some way, right? It was just the default assumption, but it was good enough, right? You got a clean enough image
I think this will follow the model that happened 20 years ago, where this is exactly why in the early days, people thought you had to run database servers on bare metal. You couldn't trust virtualization because the snapshot stuff wasn't built out. But eventually it got built out to where that became pretty much standard. 99.9% of the world used it. We're not at that stage yet in Kubernetes and containers, in my personal opinion. And if you look at the model of how long it took in virtualization, it didn't happen overnight. It happened first for enabling the very popular stateful applications, but because a lot of this is heavy lifting that is very much app specific, some of the stragglers to this day might not be supported. And there's safety in choosing your stateful apps, in the form of things that are very popular, just because the tooling is likely to be, on the A list for getting addressed first.
I know there's also been talk, and you had mentioned SIG apps also, Steve, with how important that is as well from the app side. And there has been talk in the past that I've seen where they're talking about how you could do snapshots or trigger them on a stateful set, for example, for what Miles had mentioned about like distributed apps and things like that, how you could actually coordinate multiple snapshots for an application to create consistency. And that's another thing that's important that doesn't really exist yet in the Kubernetes sphere.
So that is actually something we are working on in the data protection working group. There was a proposal some time ago on how to take a snapshot of an application. But right now, that one is kind of on hold because we are also working on many other things trying to reach there. So including the container notify that I mentioned earlier, we need to be able to quiesce the application first. And then we can make sure that we can take a snapshot of the application, and then that is consistent. Yeah, so that's a kind of ongoing. And then data protection working group is basically sponsored by both SIG apps and the SIG storage. So we also want to look at it from the apps angle.
Yeah, I think those multi-cluster apps, once again, are going to be ultimately addressed on an app-by-app basis. Some of the apps even have built-in APIs or mechanisms for doing backups and recovery, often going back to the VM or even bare metal worlds. That involved having a clustered app have some number of replicas, let's say, I don't know, it's 11. And a common mechanism was that to do a backup, you'd throw a 12th one into the pool, either a VM or a physical machine, have it join this and get enough redundancy to have copies of everything. Then you tear it out of the pool and it's no longer a member, but it's essentially a frozen point in time, and you make a copy of it. And whether you tore off one or you had to tear off 3 or whatever, the concept is that you extend your pool wider to get some sacrificial candidates. Then you sever them, essentially put in place a partitioning, and no real workload is being directed to the partition now so that it's stable, and you make a copy of it. And the state that's in with regard to Kubernetes, I suspect, is kind of early days.
Yeah, I think you'll end up with a situation very similar to VMs where 95%, you can 95% of backups, you can do them using a snapshot mechanism in a standardized way of pulling those snapshots out using something like Valero or something similar. Then you'll always have a bunch of apps that don't respond well to that. And same with VMs, in that case, you'd go back and say, well, look, does the vendor themselves have a better backup solution for their own product? And usually they do. Right? Think of Oracle, for example, or MySQL, or just any database product, really, because those are the ones that usually have the issues with snapshots, at least from the VM point of view. Of course, the entire necessity for doing snapshots is a completely different formula for Kubernetes apps anyway. Right now, the assumption isn't even there. So the way the conversations I'm having is we're saying, look, just assume that the data is, that you can save on the primary storage could be lost. If you really have backup requirements, make sure to have something in place to offload it somewhere else, external NFS, external S3, something besides the primary storage, because right now there's nothing on the primary storage except, the very basic disk redundancy. It's going to take care of data availability. So it's for that reason that I didn't really understand those last questions about availability, because what I'm seeing, what I'm used to is either the underlying primary storage does the availability for you, or the app takes care of its availability. And so the idea of snapshots being replicated is a strange idea to me. And I don't really see the use case for it, to be honest.
So this is, I think it's broader than just building that underneath the snapshot APIs, but this could be broader. Just we want to get feedback and see what do user want, right? So we don't really have a design for this yet, but this is really just to gather requirements. Maybe we don't need it. That's quite possible. So if we have it, then maybe this is we'll have to integrate this with other technologies. So right now this is still wide open.
I mean, I am a fan of the fact that there has not been these mechanisms available yet as a normal thing in the Kubernetes ecosystem, because it forces kind of modern app developers to think a little bit more about their own data consistency and their own data availability. And the more they can solve those problems, and they're going to be able to solve those problems for their application better than the platform or the infra guys, right? Because they're closer to their own use case. So, and that's been great news. It simplifies the work of infra and the platform teams greatly, because you can make the assumption that the application developers and the people running their application architectures probably have a better story around availability than you'll ever have for them. What's left is those things where they haven't thought about it, and that's where snapshots become an interesting story again. But I think the formula is going to look. I think the balance is going to look very different in the Kubernetes world than what we've seen with VMs, where you had to take care of 95%. It'll be the other way around maybe now, hopefully.
Okay, time check. We're nearing the limit of what the 1 hourness of this meeting. So any last questions, comments by users, please speak up now. If you think of something or we didn't get time, please throw it in the Slack channel or go at the meeting agenda notes afterward. But I want to thank everybody for attending. Hopefully you found this to be useful. I also want to reach out we have these meetings every month. If somebody's got other topics they want to bring up, or if you really like this one and want to continue on because you didn't think this was granted enough time, we could do that too. But please feel free to make notes in the agenda or just go onto the Kubernetes Slack and leave comments. And we're trying to make these meetings for you. Sheng, do you have any parting words or questions before I wrap this up?
I just want to thank everyone for helping us gather the requirements today and the great discussions. Yeah, if you have any other comments, questions, please feel free to reach out to me.
It just occurs to me, you're running recurring meetings in the Kubernetes project for storage, and I think you at least go to more of the data protection ones than I do. So if you want to just throw out an indication of how often those are held, just in case anybody wants a really deep dive to go right at the Kubernetes project, that might be a better place to do it than the vSphere specific user group.
Yeah, that happens bi-weekly. Actually, there will be one coming next Wednesday. I can add that link to your agenda page. So if folks are interested,
great.
Take a look, and you're welcome to join those meetings.
And to let you know what you'd be getting into, in my experience, I haven't been to one for weeks, but those are principally the actual developers and a lot of vendors of backup and data recovery products, storage products. They would love to have more users, but historically, I haven't seen that many users show up at the meetings.
Yeah, it'd
But,
be great to have users.
I think
right
they
now,
could actually
yeah.
use users kind of calling them down to earth and helping to prioritize the work they're doing.
Yeah, so right now it's mainly just backup vendors or storage vendors. Yeah, users are welcome.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. With that said, I'll close out the recording and hopefully we'll see everybody again in a month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.